Hi everyone, we'll continue our search for truth Bible studies with lesson 5, chart 5. Right. So lesson 5, chart 5 looks at how as the Jews or the Israelites have returned to Israel, right, rebuilt. So really you're looking at how the Old Testament is coming to a close, right? So we'll talk a bit about what happened, uh, some of the developments that happened between the Old and the New Testament, right? Now, the Old Testament ended with the prophet Malachi. So if you look at the Old Testament, the last book compiled, the Old Testament, is named after the prophet Malachi. And the prophet Malachi had a few key messages for the Israelites. First, he warned against compromise. He warned the people against compromising in terms of the way they worship God, in terms of what they prioritize in their relationship with God. And but the message wasn't just one of negativity. Okay, it came with promise as well. It revealed that God will begin to prepare for His coming with a messenger, right? And this messenger, as we will know and talked about later, is John the Baptist, right? This was a period of time as the Jews or the Israelites began to rebuild their lives in Israel, or what we know as Judah, or later on in the New Testament, they call it Judea, right? Bear in mind that over this period of time, they were still under a larger rule of a larger power, right? So over this period of time, they were either ruled by the Persians or the Greeks or the Romans. In fact, the Romans were the ones in power when Jesus first appeared on the scene. During this period of time, we see that the Old Testament was fully compiled. So all the 39 books that we read of in the Old Testament, they were compiled during this period of time, right? And in place of what the Israelites used to have in terms of the Levites and the priests to do worship at the tabernacle or the temple, you have new religious groups such as the scribes, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees. Okay, so without going into detail in terms of their specific functions, basically these groups were formed during this period of time because uh, the Jews were coming back together as a group of people. They wanted to restore worship, they want to restore their way of life with God. And these groups started out with good intentions, right? But over time, many of them became preoccupied with their own achievements, right? Because they were so pious and they desired to live for God, they begin to add new requirements to God's word. So faith over time became more of a performance issue. It became more of who can do more, who can be holier than someone else. And all these are about visibility. It's about being visible, about who is more religious. In the secular world, in terms of development, there are other things that are happening, right? The Greek language became something that was universal, right, across different countries and cultures, much as, for example, English is a dominant language today. So the Greek language became dominant, of course, starting from the Greek Empire, but during the Roman Empire, the Romans adopted many things that were from the Greek culture, including the Greek language, right? So this, in many ways, prepared the rest of the world for the ease of receiving God's word later on when the Jews, when the disciples went forth to preach God's word, right? Um, the Romans were responsible for building a lot of infrastructure in order for them to move around the empire, in order for them to administer and watch over the empire. So they built infrastructure such as roads. So all these other development that seem to be very unrelated to the things of God. In many ways, all these things prepare the way for the gospel of Christ to be preached more easily as disciples were able to make use of all these infrastructure to move over longer distance over a faster period of time. right? So I guess one key takeaway for us is this: in the midst of all this historical development, is this that God was preparing people, right, for something that's about to happen. And really, it is about this Old Testament prophecy, right? This is said by the Lord to Adam and Eve: I will cause hostility between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He will strike your head and you will strike his heel, right? Rather, God was speaking this to the serpent, who was in a sense, a representation of Satan, right? So back in the Old Testament, God promised one day he will begin to bring redemption. He'll bring redemption for mankind, right? And the coming of Jesus Christ in the Old Testament and what he did really is fulfilling this promise that God had given to his people. Right, so let me just read this verse. But when the right time came, God sent his son, born of a woman, subject to the law. God sent him to buy freedom for us who were slaves to the law, so that he could adopt us as his very own children. So really, the Old Testament, as the Old Testament closes, and as the Old Testament leads up to the period of New Testament, really is a continuation of the very promise that God has always intended, that one day he will come, right, to fulfill that which he has promised, is to bring the redemption to mankind. All right, so that's all we have for us in this particular session. Thank you.